This presentation is based on a
Testing,
report,
testing,
The Future
testing.
is Rural, which was published by Post Carbon Institute in early 2019, and then a related article in the American Journal of Economics and Sociology in 2020. And much of what I'm practiced in is actually food production. And what I envision is that a more local, less complex, net energy positive food system will inevitably evolve. But the implications go far beyond how food is grown. Local to regional provisioning will eventually include much of the material things we use, such as fuel, building materials, fibers for cloth, and where people live in relation to the land and each other will likely shift towards traditional patterns, like what is pictured here on the cover of my book. Now, I do try to ground the beliefs I will share with you on a materialistic view of the world, akin to analyzing the physics of golf balls as they travel through the air. Now, what if you were a naive observer, like a toddler, of this golf ball in motion, and only had a view of the first couple of seconds of flight? Sort of pictured here in the blue. What might you believe is going to happen next? Might you think the ball will just keep going up? Will we have golf balls in space? This is a rather absurd example, of course, but I believe it is a common error we make when thinking about the future that is mostly going to be similar to the recent past. We fetishize trends while not actually understanding the forces that generated them and that influence their trajectory. And so this leads us to do absurd sort of extrapolations. And I'll give you an example of what I mean that is pertinent to the talk. The United Nations has demographic projections of a future with even more people packed into cities. So here you see we're about 2020, where we've crossed over and there's more urban than rural people. And they project this is just going to keep going. And the graph ends at about 2050, when they project about 70% of folks will be living in cities and only 30% in the countryside. I'm skeptical of this view and actually about most of the plans and expectations our society has based upon extrapolations of the recent past. And this is important because hyper-urbanization is the future that human societies right now are generally preparing for and investing in. And the illustration shown here is from one outlandish example. It's called the Neom Line Project in Saudi Arabia, which would be a linear city over 100 miles long and housing about 9 million residents. We imagine this can be done ecologically, but that is impossible, and I'll explain why. Now, projects like this, as well as more modest investments such as expanding existing urban infrastructure in general, I believe are misallocations of resources. What we're doing is doubling down on previous investments because we're generally blind to the forces of energy that got us here and to the forces of ecology that ultimately constrain us. So I'm going to review, most of the talk, I'm going to actually review some basic energy and ecology concepts that will allow us to understand what is required to foster more benign futures, and hopefully will lead you to understand how I came to this conclusion. So the problem sort of comes from the fact that we tend to swim in energy like a fish in water, and so ironically are often unaware of this key factor, this superabundant energy that explains the amazing time we are living in. So what I want to do is give us all an energy lens. And I'm going to start with a picture of this Komodo dragon. And I do that because it's about the same size as a human at 150 pounds. And so even though this animal is about the same size as a person, it uses energy at a tenth the rate that a person would. So this brings up the concept of power, which is the rate at which energy is being used. On average, a human runs at about 100 watts and a Komodo dragon only 10 watts. And maybe if you've had pets of different sorts, you can confirm this, that it takes a lot more food to feed a cat than a lizard or a snake, for example. And so you need less food energy if you have a lower power demanding metabolism. And this relationship holds across animals of different sizes. Birds and mammals are active, they actively heat themselves. They're called endotherms, whereas reptiles and amphibians and fish rely on external heat supplies to warm up. So they are called exotherms. So for a given size, endotherms require about 10 times the power than exotherms. So there's this fable of the tortoise and the hare, right? It's a race between an exotherm and an endotherm of about the same size. And this is an example of the different ways of being efficient. We don't usually use that term very precisely. So if they compete for the same race and they both finish, they have done the same amount of work, but with different kinds of efficiencies. The hare will burn far more calories to run the race than the tortoise. A hare is time efficient, but energy inefficient, while the tortoise is energy efficient, but time inefficient. This is a common trade-off. Time efficiency, like the hare, is generally energy inefficient, and energy efficiency, like the tortoise, is usually time inefficient. So another important concept is exosomatic energy. So energy that is utilized by an organism outside of its own body. Unlike rabbits or turtles, humans rely on energy sources outside of our own bodies to do work. Historically, we accomplished this with the ability to control fire, to harness wind, water, and animal power. And if you look at agrarian societies prior to the fossil-fueled industrial era, they typically had access to non-human labor on the order of 10 to 1. That is, a person living could gather wood, using the flows of rivers, etc., utilize 10 times the energy content of their own bodies to aid in survival and comfort. Nowadays, we multiply our own labor force in a big gargantuan way with fossil fuels. The human economy has a power consumption rate of about over 18 terawatts. This is, I'll translate this. This is akin to about 500 billion invisible worker humans on the job all the time. And there are 5 billion actual human laborers on the planet right now. So if you do some quick math, that works out to 100 invisible energy workers for each human worker. This power, of course, is not evenly distributed. So in places like New Zealand, this ratio, this exosomatic superhero ratio, is about 1,000 to 1. Okay, so those are some energy concepts. Now I'm going to shift into ecological concepts. And I want to do so somewhat ironically by bringing up what is known as urban metabolism. Here's a nighttime image over Houston, Texas in the United States. You can see the lights that outline road networks. You know there's a power grid and communication lines are strung throughout. Under the ground and within buildings are fresh water and sewage systems. And of course, people living in households are able to move about the city and get food and other goods they need. All these systems of the city that function together so the whole is coherent are analogous to the organ systems of a body, and hence the term metabolism. But another analogy could be that of an ecosystem. Cities grow, they develop over time, and you can also imagine the parts of a city being like the different organisms in a forest. Now I'm also here getting at the heart of why the title of the talk is The Future is Rural. Modern cities especially have built-in power demand that is very high, way beyond any cities of the past. They can't rest like a lizard. They must be very active like a mammal or bird. And so this means that in any future where energy is not as abundant as it is today, it will become increasingly difficult to run cities as currently structured. Okay, another classical ecological law that ties into energy is known as the low-hanging fruit principle, which is formalized in ecology and resource economics as optimal foraging theory. And you know this one already. The return on effort will be highest when apple harvest first begins and you can reach the low branches. And the return on effort will be lowest when you have to go seek the fruit high in the tree. The same pattern, the same rule applies when sourcing for oil, timber, fish, and mined minerals. The easiest to get resources are harvested first because they offer the highest payback. Okay, another important concept is complexity. This is a bit harder to explain formally, but you will know what I mean from an example. Consider the modern flush toilet. It was built in a factory, bought in a store. Its function relies on this vast network of freshwater treatment systems, both to deliver clean water and to take it away in a polluted state. And repairs depend upon specialized parts and often expertise. So very complex systems develop over time during periods of stability, and they need a lot of power to be maintained. By contrast, here's a simple composting toilet. It can be built from all local materials. It functions independently from other networks. No fresh water is required. The waste product becomes a valuable way to cycle nutrients. And most people can maintain it without expert assistance. Simpler systems are generally seen in less stable and lower power environments. So ecosystems and societies tend to develop through predictable stages. This is called the adaptive cycle. There's rapid growth and innovation in early stages. It's followed by periods of stability and then rigidity. And this rigidity becomes sort of the Achilles heel. It finally leads to a breakdown and release stage. And then the remnants of the old system are then reorganized to set up the next growth phase. Now, if you want to sort of see how these energy and ecological concepts can come together, look at systems modeling. What tends to happen in ecological systems is that populations consume easy to get resources, this is the low-hanging fruit principle, and grow faster than those resources can replenish. This leads to populations' consumption becoming too large relative to ecosystem regeneration rates. This is called overshoot. This is the term, the ecological term, when a population has exceeded the long-term carrying capacity of its environment. Applied to the modern human system, the evidence for overshoot is clear by now, and the consequences were modeled and widely discussed in a book called The Limits to Growth back in 1972. The authors wrote updates in 1992 and 2005 that are worth reading as well. Now, no model is perfect. It's just a way of thinking about the world, and the authors did not claim that it was a predictor. But it's, this basic model has held up to the scrutiny. It's based on well understood ecological dynamics between population growth, resources, and pollution. And the key takeaway, though, is that the human economy has become remarkably reliant on what are called non-renewable resources, such as oil wells and mined minerals. This is the purple line in this graph. And as this is not something that natural ecosystems and species tend to do. So if we are in overshoot and near the peak of the resource and population curves, because we've been able to draw down these non-renewable resources, the future is one of less, not more. Less power, less stuff, less complexity. The golf ball falls back to the ground. Now, to summarize, the future is rural scenario that I'm outlining is based upon 3 lines of reasoning. First, the current scale of urbanization only developed through the exploitation of fossil hydrocarbons. And as flows of fossil fuels wane, we will not have the energy and technology to compensate and maintain megacities. An adaptive response is to live closer to the land where basic needs can be met from local ecosystem provisioning and where episodic energy flows from the environment are available to harness. Now, most people at this point have a lot of whatabouts in their heads. I probably have heard all of them and could readily answer them, but I only have time to address a couple, and then maybe try yours in the Q&A if I don't cover it here. But the bottom line is there are no ways out of the constraints we're going to face. The amount of stuff and power humans can take is limited and will decline at some point, probably soon. Okay, here's a common what about. What about renewables? Won't they just step in and replace fossil fuels and keep the services we are familiar with going? I don't believe so. No technologies, either existing or proposed, are able to substitute for the eventual decline of fossil hydrocarbons. Wind and PV have some key drawbacks that are very difficult to compensate for, such as intermittency, which the wind and the sun are come and go. This demands backup systems such as batteries, but batteries have low energy storage densities and require lots of minerals to be mined to scale them up. Well, what about biofuels then? They're energy dense like fossil hydrocarbons, but these have competing land uses with food. And so overall, when you just look at this from a systemic point of view, you expect energy quantity to decline going forward. I can't expand upon these much further here, but we'll point out a source for one of the claims. A reason wind and PV won't scale is there truly aren't enough minerals available in Earth's geological reserves to make this transition as expected. I can't go over this in any detail, but the deficiencies are extreme, like orders of magnitude. So for more information, look at the work of Simon Michaud, an Australian minerals expert employed by the European Union to do this research. Now, what to do? So what I would prefer society to focus on is the extreme energy use and how we procure basic needs and then work out how to transition to lower power modes of survival. This is perhaps nowhere more important than in what's known as the food system. It's just a part of our industrial system, but it's one that we could focus on for sure. Now, I'm showing you energy statistics for the food system as a whole in the US, and it's probably pretty similar for industrialized nations around the world. And what it shows is that energy output is about equal to the energy input for what you would call the agricultural production sector of the food system. But what ends up happening, and that's sort of the blue-gray on the bottom, which is energy consumed, versus food energy available on the right, which is the output. So literally the calories in the food. But we do a lot more with our food than just grow it, because we need to get it from farms to the cities thousands of miles away. And these last few slides will provide some final thoughts on shifting the food system for a post-fossil fuel era. Okay, here's an example of the kinds of changes I would expect. This is a cattle feedlot. It's near a place called Greeley, Colorado, where a lot of feedlots happen. It takes a lot of exosomatic energy, right, to keep the animals alive. Water is piped in, feed is trucked in and delivered to feed troughs. The waste has to be picked up and moved off mechanically as well. Without cheap energy, especially diesel, this would all be ridiculous and nobody would do this, right? Now, compare my description of a feedlot with a human city. People who study these things from a, non-judgmental, ecological point of view, they consider both cities and feedlots analogous structurally and functionally. Okay, a real contrast now to the feedlot system is when animals are spread out on pasture, where they can walk around to feed themselves, and the waste is dilute enough to be a fertilizer and not a pollutant. So here is where I live. This is a picture actually from kind of near where I'm sitting giving this talk, looking to the north, outside of Corvallis, Oregon, in the Willamette Valley of the United States. And here we have sheep, there's cattle, there's chickens, there's loads of plant species from around the world, as well as the native biodiversity that we interact with. And like you, I'm at mid latitude on highly productive soils. So I practice what would be called a mixed farming model, where livestock and crops are rotated and in some cases integrated. Now, different environments will select for different food provisioning systems. But for those of us around 45 degrees latitude with decent rainfall, this food production system makes a lot of sense. Now, let me touch upon the cities as feedlot analogy. We actually see cities and nations ruralize when weaned from energy supplies. And recent examples include Cuba, Greece, and Detroit, Michigan in the US. These are all unplanned responses to crises, where the energy basis for the society was pulled out from under them. Detroit, for example, this is a picture of these urban farms in Detroit. Detroit went from around 2 million people to about 600,000 as the auto industry collapsed, basically, in the United States. So we deindustrialized a part of the US called the Rust Belt when we outsourced a lot of our industry. And so a lot of people just couldn't move out. They didn't have the means to get another job somewhere. So they literally started creating farms in abandoned neighborhoods. But there are ways to plan for this. It's possible. Here's what's known as a kibbutz in Israel, modern planned agrarian population center. Now there's a density here. There's a somewhat dense population center, but provisioning of food and cycling of waste back to the land is not so power demanding at this scale. And pre-industrial towns, like on the cover of my book, they looked a lot like this. There are still places, actually, that are mostly rural. They haven't had access to fossil fuels to such a degree as we have. And this is a chart of the per capita energy consumption that is on the bottom, horizontal, and the percent of the population that is still living in rural areas, and that's in the vertical. And I highlighted in green the quadrant that is the most rural. And they also use about a 50th of the energy per capita as we do in the United States. And so we could probably learn a lot from studying the food systems in places like this, because they haven't gone fully industrial yet. Now, there's another sort of set of design and systems and practicums known as permaculture, and it's better known in New Zealand than it is in the US, although it is gaining a lot of traction here. It is adapted from the study of traditional, often indigenous, and pre-industrial livelihoods. And it was born actually as a response to the limits to growth studies that I referenced earlier, and the knowledge that there would be an eventual decline of our hyper-energetic society. So this is just a schematic of from permaculturalist David Holmgren on how settlement patterns in the land evolve under energy scarcity. And he has ways of imagining how current built environments can be adapted. So that's a very useful thing to examine, because we may not have the energy to actually just rebuild anywhere we want to go. Okay, I want to thank you for inviting me to speak to you all. I wanted to show off this picture of sheep, knowing we don't do sheep here as well as you do, but some of us, like me, we still try. So I hope you appreciate that, and I look forward to answering some of your questions.